Hi guys, welcome to Book Time. My name's Julia. Today I'm going to be doing a video that's a bit different for me anyway, in that it's not a traditional wrap-up or haul or review or anything like that. I just want to talk about the way that I've been reading lately, which for the purposes of this video I've called slow reading, but you could call it anything you want. The main reason I've called it slow reading is because obviously around the world we are mostly in lockdown or isolation of some form. So here in Australia and in Victoria where I live, it's reasonably strict. Not as strict as some other places, but we're all working from home if we can. Schools are closed. You're only allowed to go out for shopping, exercise, work, or something else. Can't remember what it was. Maybe like compassionate leave or something. Anyway, because of the way that has functioned, it's meant I've had my children at home a lot more. So daycares are still open here and my children are still attending daycare. However, for various reasons to do with coronavirus and the way that centres have been managing things, my youngest is at home almost full time. So I have much less time to read. Normally I work on my days off. I work on the days that the kids are at childcare, either doing writing or my PhD, but both of those involve a lot of reading time, obviously, because of the research I need to do for both of those things. So I don't have the same time to allocate to reading. And by the end of the day, because I've got kids all day, every day, except for one day a week, I'm very exhausted by the end of the day and can't really read at the end of the day. So because of that, I call this video slow reading because I feel like the reading I'm doing is really slow in the sense that I only get to read a little bit at a time. Now, fortuitously or serendipitously, or whatever you'd like to say, the book I started reading at the beginning of this period was Underland by Robert Macfarlane. Now, Robert Macfarlane is a well-known nature writer. He's written The Mountains of the Mind, I think was his first one that was really popular. He's written several other books in between, often about nature and place and space and how humans interact with it, the natural world. So this is his newest one. It came out last year through Hamish Hamilton in Australia anyway, and it won the Wainwright Prize, which is a nature prize. And it's really interesting. It's about, it's a non-fiction book. I wouldn't say it's memoir, but it's written in the first person, and basically he goes around the world looking at places that are underground, hence the title. But what he's really interested in is kind of taking a deep time look at the world and humanity's place in existence and thinking about, what kind of legacy will we be leaving behind, not just for generations to come, but he's talking like millions of years into the future. How are we going to make sure things that are underground, like nuclear waste, are clearly marked enough so that anyone who comes upon them in a million years will know definitely not to touch them, things like that. But he also looks at a lot of things in the natural world. So he looks at burial sites, he looks at mining, he looks at experiments about astrophysics and dark matter, gravitational waves and stuff that are happening deep underground. He looks at fungal networks, he looks at cave systems, waterfalls, underground lakes, all sorts of different things all around the world. But he's, interested in the way we interpret these spaces, the way they've been used, their functions. It's just a really interesting book. Now, the reason I bring this up with Strelfin to slow reading is this is quite a slow book, not in the sense it's not interesting, it's really riveting. I'm really loving it, but it's slow in the sense that he's trying to take kind of a long view, I suppose, of not just his own life, but humanity and even the existence of the planet Earth. Looking at, the geology that we can literally read into the rocks under the Earth's surface, that date back billions of years. So because of that, I feel like I'm having a similar experience during the pandemic, in the sense that it's very much forced me to slow down. I'm sure everyone is in the same boat, particularly those who've been sick or have had to actually self-isolate very strictly, for up to 3 months. It'd be really tough. So but I suppose it's forced me to slow down. You know, my PhD submission date's been delayed. Some other writing projects I have been significantly delayed. And that's hard, but it's also sort of forced me to go, well, what is important and what do I value? And is it okay that this stuff takes later? Like, what's the rush? And sort of questioning, you know, basically all the lies of capitalism. Like, why do I have to be so productive in a certain time frame? And things like that. So I suppose a lot about this book has resonated with that experience. Now, it's also been slow reading, as I mentioned, because I've only been reading a little bit at a time. But another reason I've called it slow reading is because I've really taken the time, not just to enjoy the writing, this is really beautifully written, but to look up other books that, you know, when I read something in this, remind me of something else I've read. So for example, he's got a chapter on fungal networks and mycorrhizae, which are almost invisible fungal networks under the ground that help trees communicate to each other, essentially. It's a whole new field of research, really interesting. However, last year I read Wilding by Isabella, which is actually nominated for the Wainwright Prize, which Underland won. And she's got a chapter on that as well, or part of her chapter is on, in particular, mycorrhizae and how they benefit oak trees. So because I was sort of thinking, you know what, all my timelines have gone out the window, I'm just going to put Underland aside and reread the chapter in Wilding and sort of refresh, you know, not a different perspective, but a different author's articulation of this phenomenon. Now, that may not seem very groundbreaking, but just to look up something and reread something that you've read before. But I guess for me it is, and I suppose partly it's because since starting YouTube, well, not just since starting YouTube, but as an avid reader, you know, I have reading goals. There's a certain number of books I want to read each year. So often I won't go and reread things because I'm like, do I really have to? What's the priority here? I'd rather read a new book than go back and take my time to read an old book, unless it's a book I really love. But because, as I said, all my timelines are out the window, I thought it doesn't matter. What matters is I'm loving learning about these things. I'm just going to go back and reread it. And I did, and it was really interesting. And I sort of permitted myself to have time to just think about it. Particularly, you know, we've just moved to a very bushy sort of semi-rural area with a lot of forest land. And so we've been going on a lot of walks and, you know, thinking about the things I've read. At the same time, I'm listening to an audio book in the car because the kids' daycare's a fair drive away. That is called Forces of Nature by Professor Brian Cox, based on a TV series he did a few years ago. And that had a chapter, well, it didn't, that's actually kind of to do more with physics, but physical forces like electromagnetism and gravity and stuff. But on part of his discussion of, you know, talking about the history of how humankind determined particular things about the Earth's rotation and the sun, he was also talking about dark matter, and then there was this chapter on dark matter in the Underland book, and I was sort of able to re-listen to it and go over the physics side and the mathematical side, and then go into this sort of more lyrical account of it here. And it's just been really nice having the time to find these connections. And I suppose because I'm an academic researcher, I'm a PhD student, that is what research is: reading things, then going back and rereading things and finding connection and researching that. And it's got a little bit of reading by whim and sort of just following the path of your interest, but also following the path of the research. And it's really been nice to just allow myself to have the time to do that, and because normally I don't. And another example, I'm reading so many books at the moment because I was like, doesn't matter when I finish them, no rush. This one called Mistress of Science, the story of the remarkable Janet Taylor, pioneer of sea navigation. This is very niche. It's about this woman it's by John S. Croucher and Rosalind Croucher, they're academics. And this is sort of a history text, I suppose, about this woman, Janet Taylor, who is very little known, but she did some quite extraordinary work around developing navigational instruments like sextant. She was very active in that period during the 19th century where people all around the world were trying to discover the problem of longitude. Anyway, very niche, but really interesting. And at the same time, I'm reading this book. This is all research for my writing project. I was reading Longitude by Dava Sobel, which is the story of the guy who did solve the problem of longitude, John Harrison. And then there was some overlap there, and I could flick back. Anyway, it's been really nice, really slow. And I don't have anything much else to say about it except the fact that I'm doing it and I'm enjoying it. And I sort of am wondering, like, how much do you guys do that sort of thing? Has watching BookTube or being a booktuber affected that sort of thing? It's been really nice. I suppose one of the problems that I've been thinking about with this type of reading is that if you only read by whim and follow the path of your interest, you can very easily get funneled into particular areas, and I don't mean particular areas of content, I more mean particular types of writers. So all these writers are white and many of them are male. Normally in my reading practices I read mostly women, and I'm trying really actively to read many more writers of colour. So because of that, when you're just following the path of the research, which means you're often going back to reread the most prominent texts in a field and then the books they reference, it can be hard unless you intentionally look to find writers from groups that are more marginalized in society, but particularly in the world of publishing. So that's been something on my mind. And because I'm reading a lot about 18th, 19th century nautical stuff, mostly the development of nautical instruments, back then people of color were primarily the colonized. I mean, they still are, that's a whole different story, but they were slaves, in parts of the world. So their perspective of sailing was very different, because they were often, when they were on ships, they were being forced to work or they were prisoners. So there's also that side of the story that I need to make sure I investigate to get the full picture, not just the sort of white colonial picture, I suppose. Particularly with the ocean and with nature writing, because I feel like nature writing, I love writing about nature, like reading books that have been written about nature, but oftentimes they can focus on sort of the white colonial sort of perspective of wanting to not contain it, but wanting to know everything about it in a particular sort of taxonomical way, rather than different approaches. So in my Springathon TBR, which is this nature writing readathon hosted by Natalie and Emma, I'm going to make a video about that separately. I do talk about some books by writers of colour, and in particular Australian Indigenous writers, that I think are going to have a much more, just a different perspective to all the other people that I've been reading. So that's kind of all I want to say. I've just been enjoying reading so much lately in this particular fashion that I thought I would share with you guys. So let me know how the pandemic has been affecting your reading practices. And I know a lot of people have found it hard to read at all. So anyway, share your thoughts with me. Thanks guys, bye.